Welcome to the new folks who came in. Let's continue on. I come from Oakland, California. Here for a couple of weeks doing some work, and so I want to share some of that with you. And I apologize for my accent. So, and also the acoustics in here are really, the sound is really hard. So everybody needs to speak loud. And if I say something that you don't understand, just raise your hand or do something and let me know. I want to start out with some acknowledgments, do a little context setting, say a little bit about how I got to be here, and then look at some issues of power and violence. I mean, you're talking about power, who holds it, and we don't in general. So, and then what does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean to step up ourselves? What does it mean to bring other people together? To get more people involved in the struggle for social justice. So that's kind of where we're going with it all. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the creative energy in the world that connects us to each other, that connects us to the plants and animals around us, that connects us to the earth. I want to acknowledge the earth itself that nurtures and sustains us. And inside a building, we can forget that we're still grounded on the earth. I want to acknowledge the land that we're on, and that nobody owns it. It belongs to all of us, all of the plants and animals. It's held in common, right? Whatever the legal title says. I want to acknowledge my own Jewish foreparents who have taught me a lot about survival and about social justice. And I want to acknowledge all of the people whose work makes it possible for us to be in the room together and have this conversation. So think about who made your clothes, who made your cell phone, your computer, who grew the food or processed the food or transported the food that you ate today. It's mostly by people, a vast network of people around the world, mostly poorly paid, invisible to us. A lot of that work is done by women. A lot of it's done by men and women of color. And just for us to be able to be here and have this conversation, we depend upon that work. We're interconnected with all of those people. So I'd like you to take a moment and think to yourself, on whose shoulders do you stand? What supports you? What would you add to those acknowledgments? And just think to yourself for a moment. What would you add to that?
My family.
Uh-huh, okay. Just think to yourself for a moment. What was missing from my acknowledgments? Okay. And I also want to acknowledge our children and our children's children and future generations, because when we do get together to work for social justice, we do it on the shoulders of those who have come before us, but we're also doing it for the next generation so that the foundation that they have is stronger and deeper to be able to carry on the work. So I want to bring their presence into the room as well. I want to say a little bit about the context that we're in, because we always have to situate ourselves in many different levels. And I think that we face three global challenges today. One is war and militarism. The fact that there's wars in the Congo and Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia and Sudan. And many of those wars are initiated by colonial countries like Britain and the United States, right? And we know the devastating impact that has on other peoples. And we also know the impact it has on our own communities with the cutbacks in social services and the money and the young people that end up going to fight those wars. The second major challenge we face is the economic one, the worldwide recession that we're in and the economic insecurity that so many people feel. I'm sure you know people who have lost jobs, lost houses, who are out of work in many ways. And the third challenge is the global climate one, climate change. The fact that we're destroying the planet in drastically and quickly. And I know few people who don't at some deep level have real deep concern about what's going to be happening to human life on the earth in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, within most of our lifetimes. So we're not here tonight, we're not going to be talking about these major issues, but we sit in the middle of that. And we also sit in the middle of declining empire, the U.S. empire, but Britain is very much attached to the U.S. empire, right? And as that empire implodes and deteriorates and sinks, all of these challenges get exaggerated and hyped up and accelerated in some ways. So there's a lot of things facing us, right? And so part of the conversation is, how do we show up? And what do we do? And I found that there's two questions that I use to guide me in doing this work, and I just want to kind of lay them out here to kind of guide our work tonight. The first question is a question that we often ask ourselves. It's kind of the traditional question: what do you stand for? Am I a person of integrity, of honesty, of respect for other people? What kind of moral values do I hold? And that's an important question, clearly, right? We have to keep checking in, because in a society based on greed and competition and individualism, we kept getting pushed away from the values that we hold, right? But the second question, I think, is even more important, and so I want to say a little bit about what I mean by that. Who do you stand with? In the late 1960s, when African Americans came to some of us who were white in the United States, and they were angry and outraged at the levels of racism they were experiencing. And my first response was to throw up my hands and say, well, I'm not racist, right? I treat everybody the same, I'm colorblind, all those things that those of us who are white do when racism comes up, right? And they said, fine, that's good, but there's racism in the school system and in the housing market, and the job market, and the healthcare system. Do you stand with us in the struggle for racial justice? And that was a harder question for me to answer, because what they were saying was not what you stand for, not what you say your values are, but how are you showing up, right? What are you doing? Being somewhat of a slow learner, 10 years later, the women's movement was strong, and women were responding to issues of male violence. And again, they came to some of us who were men, and they were angry and outraged at the levels of male violence. And once again, I put up my hands and said, well, I don't hit my partner, right? I'm a good guy. I treat women with respect. I do my share of the child care and the cleaning and all of that. And again, they said, okay, good, but there's 2 or 3 million men a year who batter their partners in the United States. Do you stand with us in the struggle against male violence? And again, I had to step back and ask myself the question, how am I showing up? What am I doing? And so this is an important question, but if we're not asking this question, then it's just rhetoric. It's just, we may feel good that we're against racism or we're against male violence or whatever, but if we're not showing up in some way, what difference does it make, right? So this is a question about being an ally. What does it mean to stand with people, to show up? And not just to show up ourselves, but to bring other people with us. Because it's great if I show up, to an organization, a meeting, a march, a rally, a campaign. But if I bring 5, 10, 25 other men or other white people or other community members with me, it's much more powerful. So it's not just about showing up individually, it's also about what about putting together organizations. And a lot of my work over the years has been involved with getting people together as allies to show up. So for instance, responding to the women's movement in the late 70s, a group of us who are men put together the Oakland Men's Project to respond to women who were working on issues of male violence. And our goal was to educate and mobilize men to be active on issues of male violence. And so we put together some training, and we went out and we talked to men's groups. And very quickly, some of us knew teachers, and they invited us to come in and talk to their young people, their middle school kids and their high school kids, particularly the young men. They wanted men to come in and talk to the young men, right? Makes sense. And we came in, but we had a very simple message, which we thought was right on, and we were getting reinforcement for that. The message was we were telling the young men, you're hitting your girlfriends, that's bad, stop it. Sounds very simple. But they weren't, obviously, they weren't very interested in listening to us. You know, we coming in from someplace else, and anybody over 25 was coming in from someplace else, right? And they just didn't take us very seriously because it wasn't all that relevant to what they were doing. But they were also very honest with us. You know, when we sat down and we really started to talk to them, they said, well, yeah, sometimes we hit our girlfriends. But if you're serious about helping us figure out the violence, what about the gangs? What about the fights on the playground? What about the family violence in our homes? What about the hate crimes? What about the gay bashing? There's all kinds of issues of interpersonal violence that we're dealing with. And you can't just take a little slice of it and say, this is the issue. You have to help us deal with all of it. And in addition, they said, it's not just the interpersonal violence. What about the police brutality we face and racial profiling? What about the state of our schools? What about the toxic dumping in our neighborhoods? We face a lot of institutional violence as well. And so that was an important lesson for me in being an ally, is you don't just show up and with your agenda and think you know what the answers are. You have to sit down with people and hear what's going on and hear the stories and then together figure out, you know, what makes sense. What are some things that can be done? So we took that real seriously, and for the next 20 years or so, the Oakland Men's Project was around developing ways to talk about these issues using a complex analysis, but focused around violence prevention in particular, to work with young people and adults, to mobilize folks on various campaigns and things like that. So that was one example of doing ally politics. And of course, we had complex relationships with the women's groups around us that were working on these issues. So we had to have accountable relationships with them, and we'll talk about that later. Some other things I was involved with, there was a lot of pushback against affirmative action in California, particularly. Affirmative action was the programs to set up positive preferences for people who had been excluded historically because of discrimination around jobs and educational opportunities, right? And there was a lot of pushback against affirmative action, specifically from men and white people, because they were scared about losing jobs and just wanting to hold on to the privilege. And so there was Latinos for affirmative action and African Americans for affirmative action. There was a lot of organizing around a state ballot initiative. So in conjunction with them, we put together a group called Angry White Guys for Affirmative Action, so that we could break down that framework that was being put out there and claim an identity as allies and address people in the white community and the white male community in particular and say, we have a lot at stake here in making a difference because we've benefited from affirmative action over the years, from job, preferences and from educational preferences. And so it would be hypocritical for us to be against it now just when it's being extended to other people. So that was another kind of example of kind of ally politics in that sense. We put together a few years ago a group called SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is a national network of individuals and organizations to work with white people to mobilize, train, and activate white people to get involved on racial justice issues around the country. Immigrant rights, racial profiling and police brutality, the criminal legal system, and things like that. Another project I work on is with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is women who are domestic workers who have been organizing for workers' rights in various states in the United States. And with them, they realized that it was really valuable to have employers show up and speak on behalf of domestic worker rights because it added a different voice. It broke that thing that there's one side and then there's the other, and everybody's interest is different. So we put together a group called Hand in Hand, called the National Domestic Workers Employers Association, and to mobilize employers to show up for hearings, public hearings, for legislative visits, for campaigns, lobbying, all kinds of things. And then finally, I would do a lot of work in the Jewish community to mobilize Jewish people to show up for worker and immigrant rights campaigns. So we'll talk more specifically about allies in just a little bit, but those are some of the ways that I've been involved in trying to figure out how do you organize people around ally politics, right? The people who are standing to the side and don't feel like they have a role. So let's see. So I want to, first of all though, we need to step back from that and look at some larger framework. And so I've got up here I'll read it because I'm not sure everybody can read it. But basically, I've got a chart about how power is divided up in this country in the United States. And when I mean powerful, I mean social, political, and economic power. And that means that when we look at places where decisions are made, we're more likely to see people on this side of the chart. And that means that the decisions they make are more likely to benefit people on this side of the chart. Now, if you have less power, it means you have less power to protect yourself. If you have less power to protect yourself, it means you're vulnerable to violence. So we're also talking about how groups, members of these groups, are vulnerable to different kinds of violence, right? So let me just read through the chart real quick, and then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about it. So I don't think it's not controversial or anything. Adults have more power than young people or seniors, the rich than working and middle class and poor people, men than women, white people than people of color, heterosexuals than lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, bosses than workers, Christians than Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, and people of no faith or other faiths, those who are able-bodied more than people with disabilities, people who are gender normative, male, female, more than people who are transgender or gender queer, citizens more than immigrants, the formally educated more than the non-formally educated, and people in overdeveloped countries like Britain and the United States than people in developed countries in other parts of the world. So this is a system of not just power but violence. Power on one side, violence on the other. What kind of violence are young people vulnerable to from adults? How does that look? What are some examples?
Domestic.
What?
Domestic.
Domestic? Yeah. Being hit, being beaten. What are some other kinds of violence young people are vulnerable to?
Expecting perfect behavior, expecting obedience.
Expecting obedience and enforcing obedience. Yeah.
The threat of violence.
The threat of...
I found was worse than violence.
Right.
The threat of it, the idea that it was there.
Right. If you don't...
Aware of it, yeah.
Exactly. What?
Sexual violence.
Sexual violence, absolutely. Right. We could talk about a whole range of violence, right, that young people are vulnerable to just from being young people. What kind of violence are women vulnerable to from men? Well, some of the same kinds, right? Sexual violence, physical violence. What are some other kinds of violence that women face that are different than that? Psychological violence. Uh-huh. What else?
Financial violence.
Yeah, women make a lot less than men for doing the same work, right? And don't get promoted and don't get jobs. What are some other kinds of violence?
I was thinking of ideas like children of knowledge, like not being taken as seriously or as respected because of your age or your gender.
Right.
So that as an violence.
Right. So disrespected, no credibility. Yeah, good. Anything else that comes up that? What?
War situations, violence against women.
War. Right. The use of rape as a military practice, just for example. And just one more example. What kind of violence are people of color vulnerable from white people in the society? Job discrimination. Right. And different lower pay for the same work and lack of promotions, lots of different financial stuff. Exploitation in general. What are a couple other examples of how that looks?
Police violence.
Police violence, racial profiling, police brutality, that kind of stuff.
How they're portrayed,
What?
how they're portrayed in the media.
Portrayal in the media, right, all the stereotypes and misinformation. So again, a wide range of violence, and we could go up and down the chart and talk about each of these groups and the kinds of violence that people are vulnerable to. So one way that the system works is direct violence, right? The second way it works, though, is that we don't hold people on this side accountable for the violence. What we do is we blame people on this side, right? So if a man batters or sexually assaults a woman, what are things we say to hold her accountable for it? Look at how she dressed, right? What are some other things that we say? She's promiscuous. She was asking for it, right? Why did she trust him? Right, she should have known her place. Right. Right. So all of a sudden we're asking a whole lot of questions about her and holding her responsible. And we're not saying, why did he do it and what are we going to do about it? Those are the questions that count, right? But those aren't the questions we're asking. So again, we could go up and down this whole chart and talk about the ways that different groups are blamed and scapegoated. So that's the second level. The third level is that if you hear all your life you're to blame, you begin to believe it a little bit, right? You internalize those messages. Pretty soon you're saying, well, maybe I shouldn't have trusted him, or maybe I'm not smart enough, or maybe I didn't work hard enough, maybe it's my fault. And then the system's completely locked into place, right? Because we're undermining our own confidence, our ability to resist. That's the way that the violence goes. But the system also operates on several different levels. There's the interpersonal level that we're kind of pointing out here some examples of. But there's also the institutional level. When the racism or sexism or whatever gets so into the daily practices and policies of the institutions that you don't need individuals to carry it out because it's deep in the healthcare system, it's deep in the educational system, it's deep in the housing system. So you don't even need individuals to be the active agents because you've got institutional actors to keep it going. And then above that is the interweaving of all those institutions create a structural racism or a structural sexism, and in which it's everywhere. It's pervasive, it's deep-seated, it's everyday, it's everywhere we look. It's in the media, it's in the institutions, it's in the way people think. It dominates. What? Speak a little.
The way that we speak about history and the way we teach history as well.
Right. Yeah, the way we talk and speak and teach and. Exactly. It becomes normalized. Yeah. So I'd like you to find yourself on this chart, up and down on both sides in all the various places that you find that you are. I read it out earlier. Yeah. What do you notice about where you are on the chart? Sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other, okay? Mostly on which side? Over here? Mostly on that side.
I'm mostly on the other side.
Mostly on the other side, okay. So a lot of us are on some of both sides, right? We all start over here as young people, so we get some basic training to live inside the system, to accept it, to make it normalized. And we all get over here, and there's at least one group we can pass our pain and anger and frustration again onto, which is the young people around us, right? But it makes a lot of difference how much we're on either side. The more I live on this side of the chart, the more cumulatively I benefit from the whole system, right? The benefits mount up. The more I'm on this side, the more cumulatively I'm vulnerable to violence. So it makes a whole lot of difference how much I'm on either side. One of the things that I've noticed is that we tend to notice the categories where we're on this side of the chart because that's survival. That's where we get attacked. So as a Jewish person, I'm really sensitive to anti-Jewish stuff that comes at me because I have to be ready for it, right? But I'm also able-bodied. So when Dan and I were talking about being here, did I have to ask if this was a wheelchair accessible space? No, because I'm over here in the culture of power. I know things are set up for me. I'm just going to be able to walk in. How many of you thought about if this was an accessible space when you got ready to come here or when you made plans to come here? That's part of being on this side of the chart, being in the culture of power. Things are normalized, they're ready for us. And we can say, well, my issue is really important, more so than this one, but for somebody in this side, and somebody over here with a disability who can't even get in the door, that's an essential issue. There is no issue that isn't absolutely critical. It's not like we can say one or more, some of these issues are more important. And we don't live on any one line, do we? We're actually on every single line on one side or the other. There's no issue that isn't our issue. It's just sometimes we're targeted for the violence, sometimes we're targeted for some benefits, but we're still very much wrapped up in this. And the core message of this whole system is take whatever pain and anger and frustration you have and find somebody to pass it on to. If I'm a worker and an adult, I can take it out on the young people around me. If I'm a man, I can blame women for my problems. If I'm white, I can blame people of color. If I'm a citizen, I can blame recent immigrants. Get over here and pass it on. It creates a cycle of violence that we all are part of, day in, day out, moving in and out of relationships, right? Different situations. We could stop and spend time on any single one of these lines, right? We could have a whole workshop on racism or sexism. We call this line adultism because it's a systematic training of young people to learn and accept this whole system. But we have to ask ourselves, what keeps this going, right? Who benefits from this? So we have to have another chart up here. Because we could say to some extent that nobody benefits, right? That we're all caught up in this cycle of violence. We're all vulnerable, we're all passing on violence. We could say that everybody benefits a little bit because at least we have some group to blame for our problems. But we have to step back and look at the economic system to understand who really benefits. I've drawn a pyramid to represent the population and the financial wealth of the country. And these numbers are for the United States, and I'll talk about them in a minute. They're a little different in Britain, but not very much. Britain has a little less concentration of wealth, but a lot more concentration of wealth than any other country, any other developed country in the world, and it's pretty close to this. In the United States, 1% of the population controls 43% of the wealth, financial wealth of the country. And I call them the ruling class. And we have this great mythology in the United States and England about being a democracy, right? And opportunity, and anybody can make it who tries hard enough. But in fact, we have ruling classes, just like we've always had. The next 19% controls another 50% of the wealth of the United States. So I call that the managerial class because a lot of people have jobs managing institutions, organizations, you know, and that kind of thing. And if you add these figures together, that's over 93% of the wealth. So the two classes own most of what can be owned in the United States and in England and in Britain. So they're really the owning classes. And then if that's 93% concentrated up there, that leaves 80% of us down here, dividing up 7%. Well, if you do the math, 80% doesn't go into 7% very much, does it? I mean, we're not dividing this up, we're fighting each other for it. That's what sets up the competition and the blaming and the scapegoat. And what better way to have us fighting down here than to have us fighting across all of these issues, right? This is a perfect system if you want to maintain power and wealth in the society. Let me stop and just ask, I want to say one more thing about this and then I'll open it up for some comments and discussion. There's a much smaller group of predominantly white Christian men, made up from men from both of these classes, who are called the power elite. And they're the ones that are the decision makers. If we look at who makes decisions, corporate decisions, political decisions, decisions at foundations, universities, cultural institutions, you know, at the top of those organizational pyramids, those are members of the power elite. In the United States, there's 7,000 to 10,000 of them. So it's not a small little group trying to control the world, right? Some of them are public figures and some of them are not so public. And when I say predominantly white male Christian, I mean there's a few women up there and a few people of color, a few Jews, but overwhelmingly it's a white male Christian culture, networks, things like that. And obviously they don't even all know each other. 7,000 to 10,000 people is a lot of people. In England, it's probably, it's for sure a smaller number, but still a substantial number of folks. So let me just, first of all, I'm covering a lot of stuff to put on the table to kind of frame the conversation, but questions, thoughts, comments, or feelings about any of this? Not that it's new, but it's really important that we have this as a framework and tools for actually talking to each other and for folks out in the community about it. What do you think?
I think your idea of activism, because is that what you said, adultism?
Adultism, yeah.
Because I feel like at the very core of it, the very core of everything is what we teach and how we communicate with people in our society and create and change. So I think that's really interesting and it's in the right place at the top of your list. Because at the end of the day, that's the fundamental problem.
Right. Yeah, we think it's critical. And if we had more time, we would actually do a couple exercises to help us all look at that. Because we've all been through that, right? And that's where we often start in doing social justice work with adults or young people, is with adultism, because that's common to all of us. Before we can start talking about the things that separate us, race and gender and class, we have to realize that we're all in this through adultism, through being young people raised into this society. So it's a really key tool and concept, I think. Other thoughts and comments? What?
I don't think we stressed enough that actually men and maybe ruling class men, people with a wealthy background, actually lose out on a lot of things because their education and the expectations on them in society are extremely isolating.
Mm-hmm.
So it may sound like it's great being on that left side, but actually there are some downsides to being on the left, as well as some upsides, which I fully recognize. Privilege is great, and it's very comfortable and numb kind of place to be, but well, yeah, being in a numb place is actually not very pleasant because the whole education system doesn't allow you as a man, the education and the cultural system doesn't allow you as a man, and even more so as a man from a ruling class, doesn't really allow you to have feelings, be creative maybe, certainly not have feelings.
Sure. And I think that's particularly true of just male socialization for all men. But the more you accumulate power and benefits so that you're at the top of this pyramid, it may be isolating, although there's community there. It may be numbing, but a lot of men have a lot of options at that level to deal with that. So it's not, I don't think it's a political strategy. I mean, it's a human strategy, a compassionate strategy to acknowledge that the cost of being up there. But I don't think it's a political strategy to try to appeal to men at the top of the pyramid for social justice work. Because it's not, I've never found it very effective.
It might be your allies, you never know.
Right. Individual men might be. And we call them unlikely allies when we find allies in places. But that's not as a class. That's finding one person that might be able to free up some resources for us. But yeah, that's part of the work we did with men, was to help men see that there's tremendous cost for us to hold on to those benefits. But that's not, we weren't dealing with ruling class men, we were dealing with men in the community. A couple other comments or questions, yeah?
Yeah, on the previous piece of paper, I was interested in you talking about, on one side you have rich and on the other side you have working middle class. And I wondered if you were talking about a class system as correlation to wealth or to sort of cultural upbringing.
That's a good question. I think this is an economic line.
Yeah.
But when you have wealth, you also have cultural capital and social capital and other kinds of capital that you can use for yourself and your family and stuff. So it's not just an economic line. It goes with a whole package of different kinds of benefits. Yeah.
It's almost a precondition of wealth is, I think, in university, or not precondition, but expected of someone of wealth to do that. Whereas someone else might have to come around to the idea of how that could be beneficial to them.
Right. Yeah, the expectation and the connections to make that possible, and the resources to prepare your children to succeed. So there's a whole lot of different things that go with that.
I got in a conversation with someone actually from one of the organisations that I was talking about earlier. I was trying to deal with the assertion against them that they were generally middle class, come from an affluent background. And he said, he used the fact that they were, he said that most of them were a member of the precariat class, which I thought was funny because what he meant was student. Like, they don't live a precarious life. They might not have a lot of money because they're studying, but if there's a bereavement or they lose a job or something goes wrong, there's a big comfort blanket there to absorb a lot of that stress.
Right.
So
Exactly. So
Right.
like he was like saying, well, look, he was using it as an economic indicator, but it was more than that. It was the cultural capital. It was all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you possess that stuff, it's hard to perceive it because that's all you've ever known.
That's your baseline.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Exactly.
So we know that this is the case, right?
What?
We know that this is the case, that a very small percentage would majority of the wealth, right?
Right.
So what crazy ideas do we have for changing that system? What crazy ideas do we have about changing the structure?
Okay. Well, I don't have any magic
Because
dust.
let's face it, people at the top are never going to want to let go.
Right.
Right?
Okay. Well.
So how do we change that?
I'll see.
Violence.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that is ultimately the question we need to be talking about. But I don't have, but I can just say a couple things about that. One is that people at the top never voluntarily give up power. It always comes when people organize, either in small scales or massive scales. The change only happens from organizing. And what we're talking about is how to get more people out there organized in some way. So this is a piece of that, but ultimately you're asking a very big long-term question about what do we need to do, not just to have a lot of campaigns, but to build a long-term movement for real social justice, right? We can have, and that's a really important framework for thinking about this work and allies. Because we are usually involved with very short-term campaigns or issues or projects. And we're not thinking about long-term movement building. But we know that change takes time, right? It took hundreds of years to abolish slavery. To get women the right to vote, it took decades and decades. So we need to be moving people, building allies for social justice movements through campaigns. We have to use campaigns, but like you were acknowledging around the independence campaign, if we all go home at the end of that campaign and things haven't changed, that the power has moved from London to Edinburgh, then that's not successful. That's not what we're trying to do. So what you're talking about is building long-term movement for social justice. And this is a piece of it. This is just one piece. How do we build allies? How do we show up differently? How do we bring other people together?
So eventually we just become all many collective groups that are fighting for a specific cause. We have allegiance with everybody, and eventually we can shape the tree.
Well, not everybody. There will always be. But that's
Ultimately, that's the final goal, is it?
the ultimate. We each have different ultimate goals, but I think we all have visions of the society we want to live in, and it's very different from this one, right? We want healthy communities, sustainable communities, democratic processes, you know, all of that kind of stuff.
And that's why there needs to be so much more awareness of what's happening with the campaign than it is now. Like, this has to happen with that concept pushed in to the campaign, because what we can do right now is perhaps change what happened with the politicians after we have lost the yes vote. So right now, all we can do is hope that we can squeeze and kind of twist our agendas into the politics for me. That's what we do.
Right.
This.
Right.
Just to get back to the point also, the previous page where I totally get that we are in this continuous cycle of, you know, the
Violence and blame.
right, and it just seems like millions and millions of years away to get to have a more fair and just society. That's really, you know,
The great thing about it is, though, I find is, don't know about anybody else, having an awareness of looking at the society in a new way changes how you experience it as well, you know what I mean? So like, a lot of these dynamics now you've given, for me anyway, like, you've given me a new language to express complex ideas that I wasn't able to get on the deck because I didn't understand how they interlock and interlink. So now I already, just for this, look at the world differently. It changes the way I interact with the world, it changes me. So it changes us internally, and that's the powerful thing about it. You know, like, I think sometimes we do externalise everything, and there are physical power structures, obviously. This is all about the human condition. This is all about, isn't it? Like, it's all about how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we exert power over people. So I think it's powerful. You know, like, you know, it does might seem to some quite a lofty idea, but it's just because people aren't used to talking like this. This is new information we're receiving.
Right.
You know, sorry to cut in.
That's okay, but it can be very overwhelming to actually face the reality that we're up against. So I don't want to underestimate the impact of really confronting what we're dealing with, because it's bigger and longer and deeper than we're often talking about. And it's not, I mean, societies rise and fall and change, and revolutions happen all the time. And around the world today, there's revolutions happening, right? In Venezuela and India and all kinds of places. So we need to realize that change is happening all the time. And if we have the long-term vision and building the long-term movement, then change will go in the direction that we want to build towards, right? It'll go towards fulfilling the visions that we have, rather than in some other kind of direction. So that's really the purpose of this. A quote that Dan's fond of using from Stephen Biko in the South African independence movement, who was a leader of the Black consciousness movement, was that the most powerful tool of the oppressor is our minds, right? Because if our minds are colonized to deny this, or to buy into this and be blaming and scapegoating each other, then they don't need to use much force on us, right? Because we're doing it ourselves. So this is about decolonizing our minds and then thinking about how do we show up differently? What does it mean in our practice as well? So let's keep going. We have a little bit more time and a little bit more to do.
Where did the allies bit come in?
Where does it?
That coming next.
That's coming in next, right. We're easing right into that. Right. So people at the top of the pyramid have never wanted to deal directly with people at the bottom, right? So they've created what I call a buffer zone. Series of careers, professions, occupations, which has three purposes in terms of people at the bottom of the pyramid. One of those purposes is to take care of people at the bottom, because if people were dying too visibly in the streets, people would be more angry and outraged and more organizing, right? So you have a lot of professions like social workers, teachers, nurses, child care workers, elder care workers, a lot of professions to take care of people. And what is it that we train girls to do in our societies? Look after people, right? So these are mostly female-dominated professions. A second purpose of the buffer zone is to keep hope alive, because if people didn't have some hope, they would be more despairing, they would again be more outraged and upset. And so you have a lot of jobs in the buffer zone to help a few kids be successful and get into universities, or a few families get into housing, or a few folks to get into job training programs or jobs, right? Just enough so you can hold those folks up and say, look it, the system works, right? We did it. And then, of course, if you're a community organization, you can go to your funders and say, look at these three people, you know, they got into university and we did it, so fund us some more, all right? And if you're talking about a neighborhood with 100 young people and you get 3 of them into university and the rest don't make it, you can turn around towards them and say, you didn't care, you didn't work hard enough, you didn't really want it, right? And you can blame them and make them feel like it's their fault. So this keeping hope alive is an important role in the buffer zone. The third role is necessary because people are always organizing, right, in our communities, always organizing around education and jobs and housing and access and resources. And so you have to have a whole series of jobs to keep control, to maintain the system the way it is, to step in when people start to organize. So we have police officers and security guards and prison wardens and deans and administrators and soldiers. And we even talk about in the family, the father as the discipline of the family, right? And what do we train boys to do in our society? What? Take responsibility, be the breadwinners, but even below that is to be tough, aggressive, and in control, right? And these are primarily male jobs and roles. So we have a gendered buffer zone where taking care of, control, and keeping hope alive are the main jobs. It's also racialized because most people in the buffer zone are white, middle-class folks taking care of or controlling or keeping hope alive for working class and poor people of color and working class and poor white people. So it's both racialized and gendered. So many people that are trying to actually work for change are doing it from some kind of buffer zone job, right? Something that's funded by the government or a charity or a community, trying to be allies to people at the top of at the bottom of the pyramid, but kind of accountable to people at the top because that's where the money comes. That's where the resources come from. So once again, the question is, how do you be an ally if you're in the buffer zone? Because if you're not an ally, you're part of the system that's maintaining things the way they are. So this is the beginning of looking at what does it mean to be an ally. The message of this system is to get ahead. Everybody is supposed to work hard, stay in school, study, spend the rest of your lives in a job, and move up the pyramid, right? Of course, that doesn't work for a lot of people, and so people have to turn to other strategies. Sometimes people try to get by. You know, they're just putting their time waiting for the end. Sometimes people try to get out. They drop out of families, they drop out of school, they turn to alcohol and other drugs, video games, they get out in all kinds of ways. Some people are so angry at the system that they try to get back. You know, they pick up a gun or they get into fights or things like that. Some people get out by committing suicide. Some people try to get by the system by manipulating it, right? Lying, cheating, illegal activities, gambling, all kinds of things like that. Some people survive by getting caught, because for a lot of people, the only way to actually get some attention and some resources is to get in trouble enough that people pay attention to you. The one strategy that people don't use often, because often we're not talking about it, is to get together. Because if you think about it, you can't get ahead individually unless people get together, right? You get ahead individually with the support of family and friends and teachers and a community around you. And our communities have never gotten ahead unless people got together. So getting together is the key kind of overall strategy that is the only one that makes sense in terms of both individual and community building. But it's not the one that we talk about very much. So let's just stop and focus in on being allies. Because I think that that's the core of doing this work. And to start out with, just by acknowledging that people on this side have always come together for social change, for social justice. We could come up with thousands of examples of how people on this side of the chart have organized campaigns and issues and working for justice over the last couple of centuries in Britain and the United States and all over the world. There's always been people on this side of the chart who have stepped up as allies in those struggles. In the abolition struggle, there were white people who stepped up to support abolition. When women were trying to get the right to vote, there were men who stepped up and worked for that. We could go up and down and talk about the role of allies. So when we're talking about being allies, we're not talking about some new-fangled thing. We're talking about a long tradition of people showing up and being present for those on the front lines of struggles for social justice. So what does it mean to be an ally? Well, first of all, it's not an identity, right? It's a practice. It's not something you get a certificate for. Now I'm an ally, right? And you put it on the wall and then you go home. Every morning we wake up and we have new opportunities to show up as allies in the struggles going on around us in the community. And so if it's a way of living your life and showing up each day in whatever's happening around you. It could be intervening in interpersonal situations. It could be working for change in your workplace, in your classroom. It could be joining community-wide struggles. It's a way to be present and responsive to what's going on, what's needed. But it's not an easy relationship. If I'm a man and I want to support women's rights or women's struggles, and I show up and I say, here I am, I'm an ally, and I expect to be trusted, that's pretty silly, really, right? Because all of you who are women have had lots of experience with men, right? And some of it's maybe been hard, maybe some of it's been good, some of it may have been horrible. But just the fact that I walk in the room and I want to participate, you can't trust me. You don't even know who I am. And so trust is not something that is necessary for, trust is something that happens over time as you work together, as you see each other, as you learn what the capacity is of people, then you begin to trust them and to begin to, because you know them. You know what they can do and you know what they can't do. So, but when I show up as a man or as a white person in a struggle for racial justice, it makes a difference, right? It breaks the media and cultural impression that we're on two sides of this issue, that we don't have common interests in making change. It's encouraging. It brings whatever resources I have, whatever connections I have, whatever financial resources, whatever capital I have, I can put towards that struggle, right? So it makes a difference. But if I'm showing up just by myself, it only makes a little difference, right? One of the things the women said to us in the early days was, work with men, mobilize men, don't just show up yourself, but bring other men, get other men involved. So that we weren't showing up with just the 3 or 4 of us at the Oakland Men's Project, we were bringing more folks like us to be part of the struggle. But first, we had to educate folks, right? I mean, we couldn't just let men show up without doing some education and training work with them, so they showed up in positive ways, so they weren't disruptive in the ways that they showed up. So we talked a little bit earlier about how it's hard for us to see how these systems work if you're on this side of the chart, because we're in the culture of power and it's normalized for us. As a person who is able-bodied, for me to show up as an ally for disability justice, I have to do some work. I have to learn about what the issue is and the dynamics are and how it's coming down and what people's lives are like. But no matter how much I do, who's the expert on those issues, right? It's going to be people over here. So ultimately, I have to look to leadership to people with disabilities, because they are the ones who are experiencing it every day. They have the information, the knowledge, the experience. So it's about taking leadership from those who are on the front lines of the struggle, the grassroots struggles that are going on. And that's not easy, because if you're coming from a place over here, you've been told that you have all the answers, right? You know what's best for people. And so we bring a certain kind of arrogance, a certain kind of entitlement into the room with us, unless we do a lot of work, a lot of listening, a lot of look at holding in check all those expectations that we're going to be in charge, or we're going to be important, or we're going to bring the right things. And so it's about taking leadership. But it's also about accountability. Because ultimately, who's going to pay the price if things come down? If I make a mistake as a man, who's going to take the brunt of the backlash in a struggle around male violence or reproductive rights or equal wages for women? Women are going to be, the women's organizations are the ones that are going to be attacked, right? So I have to be accountable in my work. And as an organization, the Oakland Men's Project had to be accountable. So for instance, we worked really closely with women's organizations and talked to them about what they needed, what roles did they need us to play, how did they want us to show up. And we had to decide that we would not be competitive for funding with women's groups, because one of the things that happens is funders say, oh, wow, men are involved. That's really interesting. That's unique. Well, we'll fund them and take money from this women's shelter, right? So we had to be really clear that we would not go for any funding that was competitive with funding that women were going for. So these are some of the things. There's a lot of conversation we could have about accountability, and if people want to go there, we can do that. But because I've put a lot of stuff on the table, I want to open it up for a while now so we can really dig in. And I'd like you to think about the work that you're doing, the communities that you're coming from. What do you need from allies? How do you want allies to show up? What kinds of skills and resources do you want them to bring? Because the final thing I just want to say is we don't need everybody out there. When the domestic workers worked with us around organizing employers, we realized that employers were really powerful to show up because we represented a cross-race, cross-class, cross-generational lines that broke through a lot of the resistance around the issue. But we didn't need thousands of employers, right? We needed a handful of nanny care employers and a handful of people with disabilities who employed personal assistants, and a handful of folks, of seniors who employed assistance and help in their lives to represent different constituencies and to have the skill to be able to go to a lobbying visit and talk to a legislator, or to be able to do a media interview, or to be able to show up on a rally and speak about being an employer, along with the voices of domestic workers. And so it was very strategic organizing around a small number, comparatively, of employers, realizing that it doesn't take everybody to be there. What we needed is really strategic decisions about who do we need, what do we need them to do, where do we go out and get them and train them and get them ready to show up. So what do you need from allies, and how does this apply, or what are some of the issues that come up that, when you start thinking about being an ally, showing up in a different way, or organizing other people to show up? Yeah.
I found something through the years from the perspective of needing an ally. Obviously, we play as a dual role with it, depending on where you are, but for me, I've often felt frustration at people with influence privately expressing the fact that they agree 100%, but not only what I'm doing, but the means that I'm choosing to do it. However, the collaboration doesn't go any further than private. There's no public acknowledgement of it, where their acknowledgement of it would add weight to it in the eyes of other people in this buffer zone. And so it's like, stand by the courage of your convictions. Like, we all have to take decisions that require us pushing through fear all the time. It's because everything moves to preserve itself. I've found everything moves to preserve what power it has.
Yeah, that's really critical, isn't it? I mean, we need allies, not just to say afterwards, well, I'm really glad you said that. We need them to speak out, to be there, present, and intervening. What are some other thoughts around allies?
I found that, like, in Germany last year, we did a campaign on care work with a lot of students. And to see that there is an endorsement of, well, the labour market is very gendered and that's wrong, and we need to, engage in more feminist discourse again, but then continuing sexist practices in direct interaction. So to me, what is important about being an ally is not only in the explicit political struggle of standing up and speaking out with one another, but actually through that and always alongside with that, reflecting on your practices and changing them with that, and being open to also sit down in the kitchen and talk about things when you can't stand up and be public about it, but actually being willing to change your everyday life.
Right.
And so that's kind of the other side of the medal that you can't get so much attention for, but that's as equally important.
Definitely.
Because you see, in my work, because I work in the NHS, and we're having massive cutbacks that are affecting us all as nurses in the care that we're able to deliver. And being a union representative, like, you know, I talk to people all the time, and we all agree on this. And I'm always saying, like, we're the power because we're the numbers. There's how many managers? Not that many. We need, like, I can't do it on my own. We all have to do it. Like, and one of the things is, for example, like, if someone's off sick, we use bank staff, but instead of getting the bank staff for 12.5 hours, we get them for maybe 9 hours, sometimes 5 hours. So whoever's on the rest of that shift has to work so hard, and it happens all the time. So then the long-term effect is they end up off sick. So it just becomes this circle, and it becomes so frustrating, because if we did all get together, if we could change it. And it's just how do you get people, because we all moan, we all constantly moan, but instead of doing all this moaning, why can't we be more proactive? But I think it's fear. People are so afraid, you know, and I don't know what to do about it. You know, how to motivate people not to be, you know.
Right. Yeah, it's a time when people are scared because there's so much repression. And that's real. But we know that people care too. I mean, they want to change things. And one of the things that I found over the years, and this isn't a simple answer to your question, but that we tend to think that if we give people information about how bad things are, that will motivate them to get involved, right? Except people have all kinds of information about how bad things are. Every day there's new stories, right, about how horrible things are. People respond and get involved from building personal relationships. And the people that show up at a meeting or an event are the ones who have been invited by somebody they know who has talked to them and has a relationship and said, why don't you come out with me to this? Or we need you. And there's been conversations and relationship building. And so for me, one of the key aspects of building allies is really about community building. It's organizing / community building. It's having the conversations with people over time so that when something comes up, we get on the phone or the web or whatever and invite them to come and show up and say, the idea of an ally is that it's an invitation to get involved. It's a statement that we need you. You have something important to contribute. And we need you at this meeting or this event or this rally or this protest. And often that breaks through that fear because it's an act of solidarity. It's based on that relationship. And it's very rarely based upon information about how bad things are. Although that's usually what we rely on, right? Is scaring people basically into showing up. So and that's not the way we generally tend to think about allies, you know. But we build allies as we build community. We cultivate people, and we invite them to step up because we need them. Speak up loud.
Like getting my job saying I think part of that is as well being locked into the system where you're so reactive, you've got so many things to do, multitasking going mad, right? Because there's only 7 hours in a day, and I'm probably expected in 7 hours to really do about 15 hours worth of work. So you become very tired and very distracted, and you're so busy trying to be reactive all the time that you're aware that you're very stressed, you're aware that everybody else is very stressed, you're very frustrated, but you just get so tired and exhausted that you probably forget to make that time to get together to actually do something constructive just because you're mentally exhausted. And your chances of sitting, I'm talking for myself here, but sitting thinking creatively and having that time out to unwind and to reflect, you know,
It's like as if it's like you're locked into the system that way as well. You know? And it does take you to get to your sick, to you lying in your bed, not being able to do anything because you get burnout, to be able to have that time, to be able to say what's going on there. You know?
Right.
I'm just saying that.
That's part of the culture. But it also means that we may not be looking for allies in the right places, because if we're going for people who are already committed and already overworked, they're not going to make good allies. They're not going to be able to consistently show up. You know, they might show up for a rally, but they won't be part of a campaign, right? There's a lot of people who are not so busy, or they're busy, but they're not overbooked. You know, we need to be looking for unlikely allies, people we know, and extending the networks out in ways that we're building relationships with folks that are new, that are not already in the overworked, overburdened, tremendously overcommitted activist networks, but who are just, they may be busy because they've got kids and a job and a family, but they may really have space for something that they feel strongly about because they have a relationship with someone who they really want to be, you know, working with or spending time with or things like that. But it is true that in this society, people are moving at 1,000 miles an hour all the time. And it's hard for people to slow down and actually make a commitment and actually get involved in something and stay in it for a while, because again, these are long-term struggles.
Sometimes I think, and I don't know if it's just because I've watched too many dystopian fantasies, but do you think that a real economic collapse is the only kind of catalyst that would possibly shake people out of this, break people from that stress, break people from that system? If the system fails and it's not controlled, it's not like a controlled demolition, it actually fails and no one knows what's happening. Sometimes it feels like that's the only thing that would, you know, that would unleash some sort of energy. I know it's a dangerous concept, but you know, that way it's just people have always got to turn up for their work, people have got to eat, but then something like that really disrupts everyone's apathy because it becomes about, you know, the fundamentals. I don't know, it's just sometimes I often think that, and in a sick way pray for it. Because I think that's the only solution. That's a sad day, isn't it? Where you're praying that the arse falls out of the world.
With human nature, your human nature is to survive. It's survival. So it will come and you know, flight or fight.
We played a version of the old game at Urban Roots, which is a community garden charity about people and health. And we played the Glasgow game, in which you kind of divide up into different sectors of the councils. And you look at the trends in the different sectors, health, and everything. And then you're told to think of shocks. So it could be an environmental shock, it could be complete recession, everything falls under. And then from that place of shock, you together work out how you might come out of that. And at the end of the day, we're sitting there with what would happen with all these horrendous kind of like earthquakes, tsunamis, depression, recession, all of it was going on. And actually, it would be great. It was like, God, people would mobilize, like all this amazing stuff might happen, but obviously we were also thinking we don't really want to have to get to that point necessarily, because Glasgow is completely smouldering.
Structures of each kind of like thing that facilitates help and mobilisation. I work for the council in a community centre in a far away part of the East End, which seems to be completely ignored. There's a constant threat of violence on us, on the people that use the community centre, on the children who use that centre, from other children, other adults. And the police have kind of adopted a position of, and they're very friendly and helpful, and they know the kids by name and they know us by name, but they've kind of adopted a position of acceptance that these kids are just waiting to go to jail. And the second they turn 16, then they're taken into court for things that they do so that they can do that. And these kids have also accepted that. But the worst part is that the people that are my colleagues have also accepted that. I'm finding it really difficult and really frustrating. But the problem is we work for the City Council and they're aware of this problem. I mean, people call our centre we call it the dirty secret of Glasgow City Council. It's not spoken about. It's a really, really difficult place to work. And so the only funding that we can get would have to be mobilised by them. That's just the way it is. I mean, we've got plans to do some great things in the summer and stuff that are coming from us, but essentially, in order to create something within this centre to help these children who are there, they're there because there's nowhere for them to go, and there are things for them to do, but whether or not they engage with those things depends on what's happened at home that day, what happened the day before, and a million other things. Who's with them, you know, what kind of mood they're in, how many nights they've got on them, what's breaking it. It's hard. But also we have an affiliation with these kids, but we can't do anything for them. You know, we try every day just to be personable with them and help them in that way. And whether they react badly or well, just depends again on what's happened to them. So how can we mobilise the council, who should be the functioning body who helps us and is running the centre, and just go, oh no, I mean, we can't get that funding and we can't do that. That's my real problem, because they should be our allies and we don't have them on the side. You know?
Yeah. I don't have an answer for you, but obviously this is the beginning of much deeper conversations around allies and building allies and showing up differently. And we have to begin to wrap up now. But hopefully there's a lot of ideas on the table and you're thinking about stuff, and these conversations can continue. And the Let Freedom Ring series will keep going with other conversations. I want to say a couple of things kind of to wrap things up though. One is that it can be discouraging, but you never know when a revolution will start, you know, or a movement will start. They happen suddenly. There's periods of movements, and then there's periods between movements. And the work in a period like this, where there isn't a big movement, you know, where everybody's coming together around one big thing, is preparing the ground. It's keeping the ideas on the table. It's building relationships. It's thinking about where else in the world things are happening and changing in really positive ways and bringing those examples to people. There's a lot of the work happens between movements, so that when movements happen, they are stronger and more powerful and more connected and broader than they would be if we just kind of say, you know, it's overwhelming, nothing's happening, we can't do anything, and so we'll wait until people really start to come together. So it's important that we think about our work in terms of long-term movement building, even though we're not in a movement period, right? There's no large-scale movements right now in this country or the US. Well, that means that we need to be asking ourselves the question, one, when I mentioned the major challenges that we face at the beginning, the climate change, the economics, the war, is what we're doing commensurate with the scale of the problems that we face? Is it you know, connected to those fundamental systems that we're facing? And then the second question we need to ask is, if we keep doing the same thing that we're doing today for the next 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, what difference will it make? Right? Are we doing things that are going to add up to something that we can pass on to a next generation of folks in a deeper foundation, in a stronger base, with a clearer understanding of what needs to happen? So are we building that leadership? And one of the things you mentioned earlier was working with young people. And we need to be doing a lot more work with training and working with and educating, facilitating young people. Because if we're going to be doing this work for 10 or 15 or 25 years, young people are going to be taking over, and they're the next generation of leadership. And so we have to really take seriously, if we're building allies, if we're developing the capacity of folks to step up and stand with people, this work has to be grounded in working with young people as part of that work. So I want to do two things to finish up. One is to just offer myself as a resource. Some of you got my brochure. There's more brochures on the table that has my website, that has a lot of resources. It also has my email address, so you can stay in touch and use me as a resource. And on the website, there's links and books and articles. And also, I brought 3 of the books that we've done, one working with young people, one specifically about racism, and one about something I've been working on more recently, Christian dominance. So take a look at the books, and if you're interested in those, let me know. But finally, I want to end by reading you a poem. It's a poem by a fierce Jewish feminist poet and writer named Marge Piercy. And it's called The Low Road. And it's not too long, but I think it really captures the sense of resistance and building allies and getting together for social justice, which is a phrase I use a lot. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers. They can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they will roll over you. But 2 people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon, and an army can meet an army. 2 people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. 3 people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With 4, you can play bridge and start an organization. With 6, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds. You can hold a fundraising party. A dozen can make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter. 10,000 power and your own paper. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. So thank you all for the work you're doing in the community and for being here tonight. And we'll stay around and we can talk for a while, but I know it's getting late and folks have to go. So thank you.